Hey everyone, welcome back to the Monday edition of the Goody Reader Radio Show. My name is Michael and I'm joined today by Jeremy Greenfield of Digital Book World. Jeremy, how's your summer transpiring so far?
Well, I had a little sick spell over the past few weeks, and that's why we haven't been able to talk, but I'm better now, and it's going pretty well.
All right, so I guess the one bit of news that has been captivating the world is the dispute between Amazon and a major publisher.
Mhm.
I forget the name of the publisher. I haven't really been reading much about it. Jeremy, what's the latest?
Well, it's a protracted business dispute between Amazon and publisher Hachette. The latest is a New York Times article this weekend in which each of the sides, Russ Granzinetti, the Senior Vice President of Kindle Content, who will be speaking at Digital Book World this year, and Hachette CEO Michael Peach, basically outlined their positions. And it was almost as if the New York Times reporter David Streitfeld was sort of moderating a negotiation or a debate between the two. And Amazon says, hey, this is the first time in a very long time we've been able to sort of negotiate on ebook prices without the government being involved, without publishers colluding, and we just want to lower ebook prices. We think it's better for authors, we think it's better for publishers because they end up making more money in the end, and we think it's better for readers. And you know, we think that publishers have been ungrateful for the fact that we created this whole new, very lucrative market for them. And Michael Peach says, you know, this is about, you know, who controls the future of reading, what's an acceptable amount of money for a publisher to make for its contribution to what happens in book publishing. And, you know, we have made our most generous offer of Hachette to date. And David Streitfeld wrote, and I think he's probably a pretty good source on this, that he would not be surprised if the negotiation came to an end soon, that there was some kind of agreement. But obviously, time will tell. And I think publishers are sort of waiting with their breath held. I think there are a lot of publishers out there that think that if Hachette capitulates to whatever Amazon's demands are, that other publishers will as well, and that the business of publishing will change fundamentally. You know, we had a webcast a few weeks ago with David Streitfeld of the New York Times, who wrote that story and who broke most of the Hachette news, asking him, you know, do publishers deserve to make a living? Do they deserve to exist? And he said that's a really good question. And we'll see in the future whether the current publishing business model is something that does exist. It may not.
One of the ways I guess that Amazon is trying to appear as more of the good guy in this is to offer authors that belong to Hachette 100% royalties. Now, a lot of people are saying, Jeremy, that this move is to try to help stop all the negative press that authors are making and to try to get them to get onto Amazon's side in this dispute. Do you think it's working?
You know, I think that if you talk to Amazon, they'll say, you know, we just want to take authors out of the crossfire. And if you talk to Hachette, and some of Hachette's supporters, they'll say, well, this is just a PR trick by Amazon to make us seem like the bad guys to authors. You know, I think that it's not an offer that Hachette can reasonably agree to, but it also, you know, hurts them in maybe the public eye and with some authors to not agree to it. You know, some authors might say, well, why don't you agree to it? Let's take authors out of the equation. Let's make it so authors aren't hurting anymore. You know, the fact is that Hachette gets nearly a fifth of its revenue from Amazon through selling ebooks from Amazon, and sort of to give up a fifth of its revenue stream, you know, for however long it takes, isn't really good for Amazon. And you know, or good for Hachette, I mean, and certainly wouldn't be good for Amazon either from a monetary standpoint. But because the split on ebook, if they're sold at digital list price, is 30%, 70% for Hachette, and if Amazon discounts them, Hachette basically gets all of the revenue. It's really only going to hurt Hachette. I mean, Amazon could, if theoretically, if it was paying out 100% royalties to authors, it could sell books at cost, and it wouldn't cost them anything. Hachette would just have to pay all the money to authors. So really, this would just kind of hurt Hachette, and it wouldn't really necessarily incentivize Amazon to, you know, do a better deal, because Amazon isn't really going to be hurt by by losing that amount of revenue. I mean, Hachette amounts to a very, very, very tiny percentage of overall Amazon revenues. That said, there are some authors that are probably going to be turned off by this. And I think there are some authors, led by the Authors Guild, who are going to see this as just another way that Amazon's trying to manipulate them or manipulate the situation. You've got a lot of dug-in parties here who are really set in their opinions and aren't really changing them or altering them so far as I can tell.
Speaking of the Authors Guild, the American Authors Guild released a statement saying that the 100% royalty for Hachette authors was highly disingenuous. They said, "We're not interested in a short-term windfall to some of the writers we represent. What we care about is a healthy ecosystem where all writers, both traditionally and independently published, can thrive. We believe that such an ecosystem cannot exist while entities within it are committed to the eradication of other entities." That's them be fighting words, Jeremy.
Yeah, and I think that is another thing that people don't really think about in this dispute. Authors and publishers, especially traditionally published ones, but I would also say independently published ones, sort of want to have this ecosystem where they're working with a lot of retailers, and the retailers have to compete with each other. Hachette doesn't really want to make a deal that gives Amazon more power to crush its competitors. It's not even necessarily about Amazon being able to control Hachette. There are companies that do different things, and at the end of the day, Hachette's really going to live or die on the quality of the books that it produces and the way that it goes to market with them. But Amazon does compete directly with Barnes & Noble and with Walmart and a number of others. And so at the end of the day, Hachette kind of doesn't want Amazon to be able to crush these other companies out of business. And that's what's happening in digital publishing with ebooks, that Amazon, ever since agency pricing went away, has been able to really outcompete some of its competitors like Barnes & Noble. And Hachette doesn't really like that. And I think authors don't like that. And that's what they're alluding to in that they want to see a lot of competitors out there. Now, if you're Amazon, what they're basically saying to you is, we don't want to see you win against your competition. We want to see you continue to struggle against your competition. Not because they don't like Amazon, which I think many of them do have these negative feelings towards Amazon, which may or may not be valid, but because they legitimately benefit from there being competition in the book selling space. So even if there's a short-term deal that benefits them, like getting extra royalties for ebooks, in the long term, having just one retailer, which is what a lot of authors think this is going to lead to, doesn't benefit them. So, some authors believe that Amazon is a force for good in the publishing world. Some authors believe that it's a force for bad in the publishing world. But this particular group of authors, has this particular motivation, regardless of, whether they're right or wrong.
So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this. It's regarding selling ebooks directly to readers. In the past, major publishers didn't want to undercut the bookstores because it's their bread and butter, for sending books off and having them sold. And same with, online digital sales. Publishers were a little bit remiss to start selling their own books because, a few years ago there was the ebook system was thriving. Barnes and Noble, Sony, Amazon, and everyone else. Now we have like other companies like Blinkbox Books and things like that in the UK that are really starting to take off. And now publishers are starting to reevaluate selling books and ebooks directly. HarperCollins recently started selling ebooks last October, I believe. On their website, they released their reading app, and now they are selling tangible books alongside the ebooks, and they're giving big discounts for people to be able to purchase this and actually save money.
Yeah, what's happened here is that HarperCollins was sort of tentatively dipping its toe into selling ebooks through brands like Narnia.com and a little bit through its own website. And now it's launched a very extensive, very aggressive e-commerce site where it is selling everything through HarperCollins.com. And HarperCollins.com has become a very legitimate and very aggressive retail destination. They are discounting. They are effectively competing with their partners like Barnes & Noble and Amazon. And I think that this move has a lot to do with, first of all, the leadership at HarperCollins. The chief digital officer and chief marketing officer do not come from book publishing. They come from outside of book publishing. Chantal Orsi-Rolescu, the chief digital officer, comes from investment banking and other areas of media and music. And Angela Trebelli comes from NYC & Co., which is a public-private partnership to promote New York City in tourism. And they're both very, very, very smart, very savvy executives, and they took a fresh look at the marketplace and saw what a lot of other publishers have seen, including S&W Media, my own employer, which started selling direct 4 or 5 years ago. Verso Books most recently. A lot of publishers now are investigating, this. It's a very complex operation because, first of all, selling things is not as easy as it seems. And second of all, especially when you're selling hundreds or even thousands of things, and they're all very specific, like books and ebooks. And second of all, you are competing with your partners, and that's a very touchy thing in the publishing world. So I think the move has to do with, first of all, you've got these people looking at this business problem with fresh eyes. And second of all, there's a lot of incentive to sell direct today because the barriers to doing so are so much lower than they've ever been, and the incentives are so much higher. HarperCollins is looking over what's happening between Amazon and Hachette and is thinking, I don't want that to be me. When it comes time for us to negotiate with Amazon or with Barnes & Noble or with any other retailer, should the worst happen where they sort of block our books or in Barnes & Noble's case, put them at the back of the store or don't stock them. In Amazon's case, remove buy buttons. At least we'll have this lifeline where people can go and buy books from us, and we can even say, hey, we know that there's something going on between us and Barnes & Noble. Bear with us. We're working on it. But in the meantime, you can come to HarperCollins.com, and we're giving you a 15% discount. So I think it's a very savvy move, and I think it's not only sort of harnessing trends that we're seeing across media, but also preparing for the future in which HarperCollins might have to battle with some of its partners.
Well, I remember last time we talked, Hachette actually struck a deal with a store within a store concept on the Books A Million website where they're selling ebooks directly at anywhere between like 10 and like 30-40% discount on front list and backlist titles. So it seems as though now like a lot of publishers are trying to circumvent their established retail partners and online partners as well to do what you said. If the worst comes to worst and titles are pulled, buy it now buttons are pulled, pre-order buttons are pulled, at least they're able to garner money from other sources. But do you think that this is, in the long term, from the publishing industry, do you think this is the right call? Like, if we're seeing 2 people do it now, we haven't really seen like Penguin, Random House do it or anything like that. But do you think this is the future of publishing, publishers directly selling their stuff to consumers?
I don't know if it's the future of publishing. I think more publishers are doing it now, and you're going to see it at least in the short term increase. But I know it's publishing's past. Book publishers used to own bookstores, and they would sell their books through those bookstores. In Italy, major publishers still own bookstores, and Barnes & Noble owns Sterling, which is a big, mid-sized publisher, and Amazon now has its own publishing company. If you read, the great article this weekend by David Streifeld on Amazon, he talks about this sort of future of publishing where this one author, works at Amazon Publishing, who sells his books exclusively through Amazon, and everything is promoted through Amazon. The reviews are written on Amazon by Amazon buyers, and it's sort of this one publisher, one bookstore ecosystem. So it may not be publishing's future per se, but it's something that's always been part of publishing, and people should realize that.
So I don't know if you're familiar with this, Jeremy, but I've written a number of articles that have not exactly painted indie authors in the best of light. And I've gotten a lot of flack from people in the industry, people like Hugh Howey, Sylvia Day, Mark Coker, number of famous writers that have not exactly agreed with my viewpoint. And, I expect that because I'm pretty opinionated. And sometimes, like, if things yank my chain, I feel compelled to write about it. But I think for the first time ever, your site, Digital Book World, has garnered some publicity in this respect. What's up?
Yeah. So basically, there was an article written at Future Book. It's a really good blog. If you don't know it, you should check it out on the bookseller.com about what's happening in publishing right now. It's UK based, about a new report about how much money authors are making, and it dredged up not only our author earnings report from January, but also Hugh Howey's author earnings report, which is called Author Earnings, or it's called What Publishers Want or What Authors Want. I can't remember. And it really talked about ours in this very unflattering light, and it talked about his in this like unstintingly flattering light and unquestioning. This very sort of party line that this author earnings report is the real deal, and that, you know, what we did, which is survey 9,000 authors and have a data and statistics PhD, you know, help us craft the survey and then write the report, it is somehow illegitimate. And it made me a little upset, and I wrote the author and I said, you know, how can you go through with this without questioning it? And they said, well, don't tell me how to write my article. So I said, okay. And then there was this like Twitter, you know, back and forth about how digital book world is biased against Amazon and biased against indie authors. And so I wrote this blog post basically setting the record straight. And I've said publicly many times that I think that, you know, the democratization of access to wide audiences, basically the ability to reach a lot of people through self-publishing, is one of the most amazing things happening in book publishing now. And as a writer, it heartens me greatly that anyone can publish a book. It's amazing. It's a miracle. It's wonderful. It's even more amazing that some people can make a killing doing it. People like Hugh Howey who have become millionaires doing it. And the fact that another small group of people, you know, can make money doing it is also just like, it blows my mind, and it's fantastic. But the fact is that, you know, the vast majority, 95% plus, of self-published authors, of all authors, don't make a lot of money. They don't make enough money to support themselves solely as authors. You know, I think what is a lot of money, we can argue, but, you know, I would guess that it's under, you know, $100,000 a year. So the vast majority don't do that well. And we've written this, and we've gotten self-published authors angry at us for this, which I don't understand why they're angry at us for saying, you know, that as a group, most authors don't make money. I mean, because if they make money, well, we must be wrong. So this was one of the things that drove Hugh Howey to do this author earnings report. Now, if you're familiar with the author earnings report, and you're also familiar with like data and analytics, you know that it's full of a million billion flaws. And we've outlined many of them many times before. I'm not going to go over them, but it's basically deliberately misleading. And, you know, in the first time they published the report, there was a lot of openness saying, like, we know that there are problems with this and we want to make it better. And, you know, us and other people have come to them and said, hey, here are some of the problems with it. And they've basically just ignored us. On the other hand, they say that our report is a self-selected sample, which we've been very open with. Yes, we gathered our report from the internet. We wrote extensively on what our sample is like, what our median person is like. We've also written about the fact that it's an unscientific sample, it's an unscientific survey, and what that means, and we've generated results based on that. And we've been very clear about it. And we've also been very open to criticism and feedback. And, you know, the questions that we ask and the way we ask them are going to change this year as a result. So I wrote this long scribe about why I was upset, and throughout all this, one of the things I mentioned was that the data person, data guy, who does author earnings, this sort of secret, mysterious data person who we can't know who he is because Amazon will, you know, get back at him if they know what he's doing. Meanwhile, we've been openly scraping Amazon and other booksellers for years now to generate our bestseller list. And he was outed by somebody who follows us on Twitter and was a sympathetic person. And we went to Hugh, and I said, is this the guy? And he said, yes, this is the guy. And I went to the guy, and I said, is this you? And he didn't get back to me, so he added it to the article. And then an hour later, he wrote back, no, I was just kidding. I was messing with you. He used a word that I won't use on your podcast, but I was just messing with you. And, you know, I wanted you to write an article that you'd have to retract later, which it just blows my mind that somebody would deliberately lie to a journalist in an email when they're asking you for a question. And he said, maybe I should have put a little winky face in there to make sure that you knew I was being sarcastic. I mean, like, this is a well-known thing among adults that sarcasm doesn't translate well on Twitter and Facebook and instant messaging and text messaging. Like, you kind of have to sell it pretty hard. But the point is that when a journalist is asking you to confirm something, like, it's not the best time for sarcasm. It's like most people would know that. But I guess I'm the fool for believing that, you know, when someone tells me something that it's the truth. And I do feel kind of foolish for believing it. But I did, and I put it in, and then I had to take it out, or I didn't take it out. I updated the story, basically saying that the confirmation has been removed. I mean, between you and me, I don't buy it. I do think that the guy that we outed is the quote unquote data guy. There is definitely some evidence. His name was on the first Excel document that Author Earnings put out before it was scrubbed, and in subsequent Excel document downloads, the name has been scrubbed. But that's neither here nor there. The point is that there's been this like feud that has exploded, and I just think it's so silly. Self-published authors, some of them seem to think that they can't succeed unless traditional publishers fail, and anyone that says anything nice about traditional publishers is also saying something bad about self-published authors, and that's just not true. I've gone in front of groups of authors, I've gone in front of groups of publishers, and I've basically said I think self-publishing is an amazing thing. It's basically a miracle, and it's a huge trend that everyone needs to pay attention to, and that self-published authors are really smart and really savvy about doing what they do. But I guess because we put out a report which basically surveyed a lot of authors about how much money they make, and it showed that the vast majority of them don't make a ton of money, it pisses people off. And by the way, if you go across all the other arts, music and theater and film and television acting, and most people don't make a lot of money doing these things when they try to do them. About 2% of artists actually, quote unquote, make a living doing it. And I don't understand why authors would be any different. I don't understand why they think authors would be any different, or they would somehow not conform to this truism across other artistic endeavors. That said, digital book world and me, I'm here for self-published authors and publishers who want to know more about what's going on in ebooks and digital publishing. And, I hope I didn't offend anybody. And I hope that, even people like Hugh Howey continue to read us. By the way, one of the things that got this started was that Hugh Howey tweeted that when it comes to reporting on Amazon, our bias is quote unquote horrid. Now, literally one day earlier on a webcast about Amazon with David Streifeld of the New York Times and Laura Owen of GigaOwn, he was a listener in the webcast, and he wrote in that I'm quote-unquote killing it when it comes to asking tough questions of both reporters. And months earlier, he said that the two reads that he looks forward to every morning are the New York Times on his driveway and his DBW Daily in his inbox. So I don't understand how digital book world is this horrible thing that he publicly can just throw under the bus, but privately he loves. It mystifies me, but I hope he continues to be a reader, and I do think it's a good resource for indie authors, whether they always like what we have to say or not.
Well, apparently I saw a few tweets where he said that for your rebuttal headline and whatnot, he was commenting on the title of the post. Apparently he was saying that he never even read it.
Yeah, so we posted something about Mark Coker talking about why he is hoping that Hachette wins in this current negotiation. I mean, another thing that mystifies me is people will say oh, well, I'm supporting Hachette, I'm supporting Amazon. None of these people, like Hugh Howey and Mark Coker included, have any influence whatsoever in this negotiation. What they want and what they think has nothing to do with what's actually going to happen. So when they say they come out supporting or not supporting something, it has no real effect. But Mark Coker wrote basically on why he hopes Hachette is going to win the negotiation, and we had a headline for the article, Smashword CEO, blah, 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 blah. And then we had our newsletter headline, which is basically meant to get you to open it and read more and click in, which says, prominent indie author says blah, 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 blah. People took exception to us saying that Mark Coker was a prominent indie author. People, I think, put a little bit too much emphasis on labels sometimes. Indie authors don't want to be called self-published authors sometimes. They want to be called indie authors. And there's a lot of argument about what is self-publishing. If you Author Solutions and you say Author Solutions, publish my work, is that self-publishing? Well, a lot of self-published authors don't think that is self-publishing, which I just don't understand that at all. So basically, they don't think Mark Coker is a prominent indie author. I mean, he does run Smashword, which is a huge distributor of indie titles. He has several books that are out there. He's for 600,000 downloads. I know that many of those downloads are free, but he's been very well read on the topic, and he's certainly knowledgeable, but not just what indie authors say, but what indie authors do through his platform. So the whole anger about it really just confused me. And I just wish indie authors and everyone in the industry would, think about how we're all in this together. We all love books. We all love reading. We all want to see the advancement of literary culture. We all want to see, people read more. I don't care who sells the books, to be quite honest, but I think a lot of them out there do want to see like a more a more diverse retail ecosystem. So we're basically all in this together, and I wish that self-published authors and everybody could sort of, instead of focusing on our differences, focus on what we have in common.
Well, it's very a utopian viewpoint. I have been quite vocal about, distinctions and how everyone seems to label each other in different ways when it comes to publishing. You're an indie author, you're a self-published writer, you're an author, you're a self-pubbed author, you're a best-selling author, you're a no-selling author. And I always thought that, it's either you're a writer or you're an author. If you could derive your sole living from the process of writing, you're an author, and for everyone else, you're a writer. And that includes like online journalists, people that like contribute maybe an article a month to their local paper. I just think that like there's just so many distinctions when it comes to labeling writers. Like, it just gets lost in the cacophony of terminology, where you look to the average reader who's trying to find more about maybe an author that they like, or maybe a book that they heard about, and just like all these terms are just thrown out there, and they're just wondering what it all means. When you're in a publishing world like us, we understand what all these terms mean, but for the average person, it's too convoluted. So I just thought, you're a writer or you're an author. Just because you write a book doesn't mean you're an author, but if you're successful or you make some sort of like living from it, then you can be an author. So I've always kind of thought that the classification system for authors or for writers is just, it's too confusing, and it needs to be simplified. Otherwise, you don't, as we're seeing now, everyone's just polarized. You have sites devoted to like author bullying now, and you have like communities of authors that are all about, someone left a negative review on my book on Amazon, everyone go downvote it and I'll leave a positive review for your book. And people do things like that. So yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty despicable that people will do things like that, but it is a dog eat dog world. So I don't know if you can totally blame people for that, maybe blame the system. But I would also say, to me, those distinctions aren't important except when you're talking on like an academic level, excuse me, when you are wondering whether, who's making money publishing, and let's do surveys of authors and see who's doing what and why, then I think it's important to classify authors, because you don't want to lump in all of the people who haven't even published a manuscript yet with people who have only self-published, with people who have only traditionally published, with people who, have hybrid published, but their last book was traditional versus their last book was self-published, or their last book was reclaiming back rights. I think then it's important to make distinctions. But, Michael, you and I don't always have to agree on everything, do we?
No, and that's the fun of it.
Yeah.
So I was at the American Library Association annual conference, and there was two major trends that came out of the show. I've talked about it on a previous show when I spoke with Mercy Pilkington, staff writer here at Good E-Reader, but I wanted to get your impressions of it. So the two trends were pay per use, which is a library, instead of having to buy titles in advance, could simply offer all of the titles, and they only pay if a user checks a title out. So it makes collection managers' jobs a little bit easier, because they don't have to pick and choose or try to understand the community. They could just say, look, here's 100,000 audiobooks, download whatever you want, and they could establish thresholds, daily, weekly, or monthly spending limits. Makes things a little bit easier. That was one of the major trends of the show. Do you think that this is going to catch on?
I think that kind of acquisition is going to be work. It will work for some, but not for others. And it's problematic because there are situations in which librarians can get into that kind of acquisition that they will very soon regret. So let's say 50 Shades of Grey comes out, and 50 Shades is part of this pay-per-use library. Well, the patrons could very quickly go through all of the copies of 50 Shades of Grey, all of the library's budget by reading too many copies of 50 Shades of Grey. I mean, maybe some kind of metered or access of that kind, that the library could slow it down if there was a very popular title, or they could set limits on certain kinds of titles, or or in certain situations where there would be sort of like triggers that if something was being borrowed too much and it was breaking the bank, that it would sort of slow down or turn off, or there would be some kind of limits. I think a hybrid version of that might be something that a lot of libraries would find attractive, because it would take a lot of the guessing out of acquisitions and collection development, especially for ebooks, where you have to make really good choices because you can't resell the books the way you can with other books. It's definitely a much harder thing for librarians to cope with. So I do think it's promising. I don't think in a sort of straight ahead form that it would work for most libraries.
The second major trend, and this had garnered a tremendous amount of negativity, like people were outraged by the fact that Simon and Schuster has mandated that if libraries want to have their ebooks, so backlist, frontlist titles, the libraries have to offer a buy it now button, and they must have like e-commerce solutions. Now, all the top library distribution companies, 3M, Cloud, Baker and Taylor, Overdrive, they've all developed these systems. So it's not like a library has to get involved in e-commerce, but their existing partner that facilitates ebook lending has this system. But a lot of libraries were saying that this is an abuse of public trust, because we're going to have to get into retail if we want to be able to offer, the latest James Patterson book or something like that. What are your thoughts about libraries as retail?
I mean, a lot of them are already doing it, and a lot of them are doing it as ways to stay afloat and to make money. I don't know if that means it's right or not. I'm just saying that it's not like every single library in the world is plunging at this. I think probably a lot of them are upset at being told that they have to do something rather than entering into it voluntarily. I don't think people in general really like that when they're told that they have to do something.
Yeah.
But this, unfortunately for librarians, are the conditions under which they have to do business with these big publishers. Now, I would say to them, if you really want to send a message to the publishers that you don't like the terms under which they're doing business with you, then don't buy the books. Find some other way to spend the money. There's got to be alternatives to bowing down to these terms. And, get really good at marketing. If your patrons complain to you and they say, why don't you have this book available, or why can't I get this book? You have to market aggressively and say, here are the reasons why we can't have this book, but here's what we've done with the money to make sure that we're serving you well. And the other thing that I would say is you could also, have a very minimal collection of ebooks if you don't like the terms. So, the big book comes out from the publisher that you don't think is doing a good job, buy one copy of the ebook. So you have it, and the patrons do technically have access to it. But you're also not giving the publisher, the business that they want. The publishers are doing these things because they're seeing that it works for them. It works for their business. They need the library channel in a lot of ways because libraries help with book discovery, and it's also a revenue source for them. So if you just continue to do business with them on the one side but complain about them on the other, you're sending a mixed signal. So I think that, I'm not going to say that libraries deserve what they've gotten with ebooks, but they're not really helping out their own case by continuing to buy ebooks from publishers under the terms that they say they don't like.
I listened to the president-elect of the American Library Association, and she had nothing but glowing things to say about the deal, saying that this was a tremendous accomplishment to have Simon & Schuster on board on a nationwide rollout, and libraries should be thankful that they could now buy frontlist and backlist titles, but she did not mention the buy it now button at all. And this, behind the scenes, I stopped probably over about 150 librarians, mostly young, hip, cool girls, and it just gave me an in to like chat them up. But that's besides the point. Damn it, I'm a journalist and I had important questions to ask. Email and phone numbers aside. But I kid. Or am I? Anyways, everyone was like really negative about it. And it seems as though that the Ayla administration is just counting their stars that they managed to get Simon and Schuster, into the playing field. That they're there and they could all pat themselves on the back that all their lobbying through Washington came through, and all of the years of negotiating with them one by one in New York is suddenly coming to fruition. But the actual terms are really pissing off librarians. But your average librarian really doesn't have any clout. They, sure, one or two libraries could say, we don't like these terms, we're not going to proceed with them. But at the same time, who's even going to know? I think that maybe a boycott is called for, or maybe a change.org petition, something where libraries could band together and have a unified voice outside of the Ayla administration, which really to me seems pretty self-serving at the moment. Do you think a boycott would work?
I don't know if these things would work, but I'm just saying, as somebody who knows a little bit about negotiations, that when you tell the person you're negotiating against, on the one hand, that we don't like your terms, but on the other hand, continue to enthusiastically do business under those terms, you're not helping yourself out. So I don't want to say that libraries should boycott publishers or should boycott, the distributors that distribute ebooks to them. But I'm saying that if they do want to get the publisher's attention and actually say, we don't find this acceptable, then you have to put your money where your mouth is. I'm not going to say that that's a boycott, but that might be, one way of doing it.
One of the last things I want to talk about is free ebooks. And I saw a Smashwords survey that they did, primarily centered around Apple iBooks. And they tracked the last 3 or 4 years of free titles versus paid titles. And in the past, when everyone was buying a new iPad and a new Kindle, when those started really hitting the mainstream, everyone was downloading books, everyone was buying books. There was record revenues for, all the e-reader manufacturers, for the people making the tech that comprises of them, but also, companies like Barnes & Noble and Sony and Kobo, they all were making a lot of digital revenue around this time. But what we've seen is the ratio really even out. Let's look at some stats. In 2012, for every one purchased book, 100 were downloaded for free. In 2012, for every one book purchased, 91 were downloaded for free. And in 2013, for every one book purchased, only 39 were downloaded for free. So the question I have to ask, Jeremy, is authors relying on giving their books away for free in order to build their name, or to give the first book in a trilogy away for free in order to get those 2 paid purchases for the next 2 books? Do you think that what's happening with free?
A lot of those ebooks are books that are not meant to ever generate sales per se, that they're books that people give away to let someone know that they're an expert on a topic, to share information. Ebooks have gone beyond, pleasure reading and people paying for books. I think that a lot of those free downloads are not, self-published authors necessarily just giving away book content for free, although some of them are. Some of them are established publishers giving away book content for free as well. A lot of those downloads are ebooks, entering different things. And I would make a distinction in surveys like that between books that are sort of given away as, a freebie because I want to tell you that I'm an expert in something, versus books that are, given away as part of a promotion, or just I want to share my writing with the world. And also, consider how things like Wattpad impact this sort of thing.
Yeah, when I look at the iBooks, the best, the top downloads list, paid list is all great writers, famous people that are household names and so on. And then you look at the free list and it's like, how to get the most of your iPad, how to troubleshoot the iPhone 5S, how to do this. It's basically like a lot of nonfiction tutorial guides, and then you see like the odd erotica title. So it seems as though that because free is not doing as well as it used to be, it seems as though that the free that does well the most is kind of what you said. It's a lot technical, it's a lot of nonfiction. It's certainly not pleasure reading. So this is not indicative to the ebook market crashing, but it's a growing. Book sales were up 3.8% in 2013. We saw about $1.3 billion worth of revenue being garnered from it. And even companies like Microsoft are finding that, just because we're giving away 300 super advanced technical ebooks for free does not necessitate a copious amount of downloads. I was looking at the top 300 books that Microsoft just announced that they're giving away for free. How to program, it's just very technical, geeky stuff. And it's like 1 download, 5 downloads, 15 downloads. And I could just, if they would have done this like 2 or 3 years ago, this probably would have been in the thousands. Before we wrap up the show today, do you have any final thoughts or anything that you want to talk about that we haven't touched on?
No, I'm just curious to see what happens with Amazon Hachette. I thought that the dispute, to be quite honest, would go on through the rest of the year, that we would be at Digital Book World 2015 in January, and that the dispute wouldn't be resolved. But, a very reliable reporter on the topic thinks that we actually will see something soon in terms of resolution. So I'm going to watch that carefully over the next few weeks, and I think everyone else should as well.
Yeah, I mean, they're crunched for time because I do know that there's a window period in which the second negotiation has to start because Hachette was one of the first, and now Amazon's in the process of renewing almost all of their major publishing contracts. I think the only exception's Macmillan because they did it like a few years ago, but a lot of other publishers are going to be able to make pretty big news so on because I guess with the whole agency pricing thing that the Amazon can't negotiate all the contracts at once, but it's much like Apple where it has to be like in increments. So it's like one publisher, and then once that's resoluted, then there's the next one that has to be done. So it's like this line of publishers that are basically not looking forward to having to renegotiate their contracts with Amazon. So my question is, Jeremy, I know a lot of people are sick of all the Amazon Hachette news. The next contract negotiation that Amazon has to do with a major publisher, do you think it'll garner similar publicity?
Absolutely. Unless it gets done quickly, I think it absolutely will. And I think that the two to look out for are HarperCollins and Penguin Random House. HarperCollins because the company's been incredibly savvy in working with retailers and really doing everything that it has had to do over the past few years when it comes to digital stuff. And Penguin Random House is the largest publisher in the world, and watching how that company goes is going to be really interesting.
A lot of people said when Penguin and Random House joined forces that they were joining forces just to have better negotiating powers over Amazon.
I think that that's a fair reading of the situation. I don't know if it's entirely true, but
well, it's not the sole reason, but that was a proponent of it because they wanted. I think they wanted just better negotiating power with all their retail channels. Whether it's a Barnes and Noble store, a Funac, and or all the big stores, Waterstones, Chapters Indigo in Canada. It really gives them bigger negotiating power if you're responsible for 1/4 of all books being published in the world. All right, so we'll leave it at that, folks. Jeremy, thanks for joining me. You guys have been listening to the Good E-Reader radio show. You can listen to us on our website, goodereader.com. You can also listen to it on iTunes via the podcast. We're also on SoundCloud, SoundHound, and TuneIn Radio, so you can search for us there. And everybody, take care.